We have a great members of the panel here to help us break down literally what's wrong with traditional proteins and how they're trying to fix the problem. We have Ethan Brown at the end, to my right, the founder and CEO of Beyond Meat. The company is dedicated to building meat directly from plants. Beyond Meat sells products in 1,100 stores throughout the U.S., including the Beyond Burger, which I've tasted, the first plant-based meat to be sold in the meat aisle at Whole Foods Market. Next to him, to my right, Uma Valeti, CEO and co-founder of Memphis Meats, a competitor to Beyond Meats. We'll get into that in a little while. Memphis is the world's leading clean meat company producing meat directly from animal cells without raising animals. The company made history by releasing chicken, duck, and beef grown directly from animal cells. And then we have Jeremy Coller, Chief Investment Officer of Coller Capital, founder of the Jeremy Coller Foundation. His firm is invested in approximately 1,600 private companies worldwide with the current AUM of approximately $17 billion. He recently launched FAIR, a collaboration network that shares research, thinking, and best practices to help investors get animal factory farming on the ESG agenda. So let's start with let's start with the problem that you all are trying to address, which is the challenges that traditional protein sources are facing, and they range from health risks and outcomes to environmental ones. So if you guys, Ethan, because you were late, you're in the hot seat, so you can kick it off.
Okay. Sure. So first of all, thanks everyone for being here and for your interest, and thank you, of course, for putting together such a great panel. I really look at this around four things that I care deeply about. And what was fascinating to me about 10, 12 years ago was beginning to understand that I could potentially contribute to meaningful solutions in each of those four areas by doing one thing. And that was focusing on replacing the animal protein at the center of our plate with plant-based protein. And those four things really are human health, their climate, natural resource use, and animal welfare. And if you look at human health, not a 6-month period goes by without some report coming out that's making some connection between the animal protein that we consume and the levels at which we consume it and things like heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. And you look at climate change, and there's been a number of studies that have been done. The one that I have the most confidence in is the one that was done by Robert Goodland and Jeff Anang, both of whom were with the World Bank. So not exactly a left-leaning organization, an organization that often is at odds with the environmental community. But what these two scientists wanted to do was to understand what's truly driving the majority of emissions in the world. So they looked at livestock, and they came up with a number that said, it's 51% of greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to livestock, whether it's changes in the soil through the fact that there's an unnatural number of animals on the Earth's surface, and every animal breathes, and when they breathe, they're respiring carbon. And that actually contributed about 14% of their total number. You go to natural resources, you look at water use and energy use and running plant material through a bioreactor, which is the animal, that's not efficient. That's a tremendous amount of use of water, land, and energy. And then animal welfare really depends on where people's sort of philosophical and religious beliefs on this lay, but there's 66 billion animals that are being slaughtered every year, and I think more and more, particularly as technology brings us closer to that process, people are opting out of that system. And so those were the four problems. I said, look, if we can basically build a piece of meat directly from plants, innovate in a way we've done throughout our culture and our history, and America is really great at this, making good things better. If we can make meat better by building it directly from plants, we have a winner, and we have a winner that can solve for those four problems.
I think you guys all agree on that, so there's no need to belabor the current problems in the system, although I know that you have some specific points you want to make. But Uma, given what Ethan just said, it sounds great. The products, the idea sounds great to create meat from plants or build it as you're doing in a petri dish, essentially. But what are the real world challenges to actually executing on that vision? I would assume they would range from consumer acceptance, adoption, to price and getting the price down, especially for your technology.
Yeah, I'm going to add something to what Ethan said. We're looking at Memphis Meats as meat consumption increasing by the decade and doubling by 2050 as an indicator of how much people love eating meat. So that's not the problem. It really is what people want to eat. And our thesis is fundamentally different. People want to eat meat, And we want to get meat to the table through a different process, not change what they're getting. So our thesis really is, although we are allies in our end goals, our mission is meat and our mission is not plants. And ultimately, we don't think we'll be able to trick the people's taste buds. But when you raise animals, you're raising a certain type of protein and a flavor profile and a taste profile that's evolved, through nature and biology. When we raise animal cells, like Memphis Meats is doing, we are basically recapitulating all of that, except that the cells are growing outside of an animal. So to answer your question, Cristina, the only barrier we have really is cost. Because as we start talking about our product, as we start having people look at it, taste it, smell it when it's being cooked, it's a magical moment. It just demystifies what people think in their minds. And they see a piece of meat that's grown directly from animal cells. It smells the same, it tastes the same, it has the same aromas when they're in the room. And that's the magical moment.
But it doesn't taste the same just yet.
Well, it's continuing to get better, but what we did...
It's a work in progress.
Oh, I think so. You may or may not be. So March 4th, I agree with you. Okay.
Okay, there we go.
But here's the beauty of it. Our production runs are 3 to 4 weeks. Every 3 to 4 weeks, we are finishing the growing of animal cells into meat and harvesting it and learning so much from the taste and the texture and fine-tuning these cells to what we want. But we also did one thing very unique for any startup. No one's ever done this before. Right from the origins of our company, we've been inviting people to come and taste. And on March 14th in San Francisco, maybe we can show this video, kind of opens up the discussion on slide number 2, if we have that to play. We had 25 people. Let's just show this for a minute.
Tastes like chicken. Yes.
So this is duck now. Anyway, the point of that is that's the magical moment. And we had 25 people on March 14th in San Francisco, including 2 independent reporters from the Wall Street Journal who love eating meat. And we just said, well, taste it, declare to the world what you think about it. And the 90 seconds they were tasting it, our team was on, they were on the edge of their seats, nail biter. But they came out and said, delicious, nailed it, and we'll go back for more. And this is very early in the process of our company, and we can only see it getting better. So we feel like on the taste and the texture, we still can continue to improve. But the fundamental barrier for us is cost. And a few years ago, people thought it's impossible to do what we're doing. That was when it was cost more than $1 million a pound to make it. Last year, we came down to about 18,000. When we did the Wall Street Journal production run, it was about 9,000. Since then, we've lowered it by $1,000 a month for every month, and now we're at about 6,000. So I couldn't have imagined how rapidly we're dropping down the cost curve. And the only analogy I'll have to you is 2006, 2007, before the iPhone was released. The cost of one production model, the first one was $3.4 billion. Now it's one of the most affordable things across the planet, and we just have to wait and see.
So can you ask them which one are going to win in the market?
Well, I'm going to actually let you answer that question.
Oh, I think they need to answer.
No, you brought up the question. You answer it.
I'm invested in both of them, so I'm good to go.
So you're spreading your. But so we know what the opportunity is because Ethan and Uma have laid it out.
Yeah.
People are eating more meat. The environment is taxed by producing it. So we're in an unsustainable or unsustainable environment. What risk is there for investing in this?
I think to answer that, if I may, is just how we got to this problem. And, so Ethan very, very well, mentioned that it's the #1 user of fresh water. It's the #1 reason for deforestation. 91% of Amazonian deforestation is due to livestock production and creating the food for livestock. And it's the #1 user of antibiotics worldwide. 80% of all antibiotics in the US are used on factory farms. But why did we get to this situation? We're talking about a food technology revolution here. There was a green revolution. The green revolution happened, just put it in context.
80% of antibiotics, I don't know if people make the distinction between antibiotics for human use versus antibiotics for animal use, right? So what does the 80% represent? Just so everybody understands.
Let me give you a point on that. So we've been told antibiotics don't transfer from animals to humans. Lance talked about this at the dinner the other night, but also antibiotics, colistin is a last resort antibiotic. It's very rarely used on humans, but used as a prophylactic every day on pigs. Now it's resistant in humans. But just last year, both in Asia, Europe, and the US, that is a major problem. We haven't been able to, it's like smoking in the 50s, we haven't quantified the transference yet. And all these, Lance was talking the other day about all these antibiotics. Some of them may be just for humans and not used on animals, but they're all connected. And, but how did we get to this situation? This situation happened because of the Green Revolution in the 50s. We discovered or invented herbicides, pesticides, chemical fertilizers, and being able to create new wheat strains. We had such an abundance of cereal yield in the US that farmers were going bust. What do we do with the abundance of grain that we have in the US? And that's when we said, well, you know, we've also discovered antibiotics, so we can put them very close quarters. Let's bring animals into cages and feedlots, and you know, cows that eat grass. Let's bring them into cages and feedlots, and we can give them grains to eat. That is why we have such a greenhouse gas problem from them. More greenhouse gases than the whole transport sector. It's phenomenal, because actually cows can't digest grain. You know, they're given hormone treatment to digest grain, but they still fart a lot more.
So we've addressed two of the challenges, which is taste and cost.
Sorry, just go on
Yeah.
about the risks. So what we're seeing is food companies like Yum Foods underperforming the public markets. It's a massive company. It's KFC, Pizza Hut, underperforming the public markets the last 5 years because they've had various food epidemics. Hellmann's mayonnaise has been taken. Compass Group serves 8 million meals a day in the US to schools, prisons, and 8 million meals a day. And they have replaced all their mayonnaise with the Hampton Creek mayonnaise, a plant-based mayonnaise, because there was an avian flu epidemic here last year, and there's spiraling costs. There's the other risks. The largest meat recall in US history was a company called Hallmark Westland. 65 million kilos recalled, and equivalent to 195 jumbo jets. And this was recalled from California. The reason it was recalled, it cost nothing. It was an investigative reporter in the US. So paid for by Hallmark Westland. Simple film, went viral, and it cost them $116 million to recall the meat. That was nothing. They could do that. But then there was a class action. If you've got such bad animal welfare, how can you have health and safety? Just 2 weeks ago, the largest meat producer, exporter in the world, BRF and JBS in Brazil, rotten meat. These are investment risks. Your CNN produced a program called Blackfish. I mean, just as an analogy of investment risk. And that Blackfish was on SeaWorld, like the trainers, but the lens that people looked at it, attendance down, the way an investor looks at it, it was 1.5 billion of investor value shareholder value destruction, because Jerry Brown, regulatory issue, has said that ban the use of breeding of orcas. By the way, Jerry Brown has also banned the prophylactic use for farmers using antibiotics, which is an investment risk. And so, you know, this is translating. It's not just about these growth companies that there are solutions, but it's also about these very large companies having to address it. So what we did at FAIR, there are things at the back of the room. It's an investor network. There is a knowledge gap for us. And what we did was we wrote to, for instance, we got $2.5 trillion to write to 10 restaurant chains, asking them what are they doing about antibiotics in their food supply chain. And it's an investment risk, because we're seeing, you know, Shake Shack has way outperformed Yum Foods. We're seeing BRF, which is that Brazilian meat company, lose 2.2 billion of its market cap 2 weeks ago, and it's not going to. It's a public company in Brazil, but it's not going to be able to IPO in the US in June, which it was hoping to do.
And yet large companies are invested in the status quo for the most part. What has been the meat industry's reaction to each one of your products?
Yeah, so I think in our case it's been on the main positive. Tyson took out a 5% investment in my company, and we work closely together. I think increasingly some of the more sophisticated meat companies are thinking about how do they position themselves as protein companies, and I think Tyson is doing a good job in accomplishing that. And for me, it's really around can you separate the categories of meat, and I think the words we use are interesting. We talk about beef, we talk about poultry, we talk about pork. Can you separate those from the animal and not focus so much on chicken, cows, and pigs, but think about those categories of pork, of beef, and of poultry. And we can create those categories. We can create poultry, beef, and pork, but directly from plants. And if you think about the concept of what meat is, if you think about the composition of meat, it's really 5 things. It's amino acids, it's lipids, it's almost no carbohydrates, a very small amount. It's trace minerals, and it's water. Those don't need to come from an animal. It's a fixed assumption that's wrong, right? So for about 1.8 million years, as a species and as our predecessors, we needed to use an animal to create the composition of meat.
Absolutely.
But we now have the ability to pull those materials directly from plants and to put them in the architecture of animal muscle or meat. So why wouldn't we do that? We do that in every other part of our lives. We don't get from A to B as we used to. We used to do the horse-drawn carriage, now with the automobile. We don't stay tethered to a landline. We have a mobile phone. So we are about progress. And I think we haven't looked at the animal and said, do we really need the animal anymore? And the answer is we don't. And what our scientists are doing is basically taking, if you think about the origin of protein, right? Protein is in plants. We're taking it directly from that, and we're applying heating, cooling, and pressure to it to put it in the form of muscle. Heating and pressure are basically some of the 2 most elemental forces on the planet. If you have a diamond on, that's how it was created. So we're not using something that's sort of frankenfood. We're using basic principles of material science.
I've been eating vegetarian burgers for 30, 40 years or whatever. Mm-hmm. But a key differentiator with what you've done is you've got it on the meat aisle.
Yeah. And so we got into the meat case at Whole Foods. We're actually in 11,000 stores, and in the important breakthrough today is that we're now in the meat case at Whole Foods, and I really wanted that because I wanted consumers to buy our product and make the decision where they make their protein purchases, not have to go to the penalty box of the meat alternative case. We're really about selling meat and helping consumers to continue to enjoy what they love, whether it's a hot dog or a burger, et cetera, but just have it from plants. And I think it's incumbent on us to make it good enough so it's indistinguishable. Once we get there, there's really no reason not to use our product. Now, we're not there yet. Our products are good, but they're not great. And so year after year, we get better and better. I'll say one more thing. I came out of the alternative energy sector, so I worked on fuel cells for a long time, and we spent over $1 billion creating hydrogen-powered fuel cells. At one point, the company I worked for was valued at higher value on the market than Ford. I can tell you that I didn't want to get involved in another project where I couldn't see a cost curve that came to life, right? I needed to see something that we could get to the point where we could commercialize at a price that would be lower than meat. We can do that with this. When you take out the middleman of the animal and you take protein directly from plants and you provide it in the form of meat to consumers, you can do that at a cost that's lower than animal protein, and that is really exciting.
So Uma, Ethan said he can recreate meat from plants. You disagree?
She's trying to. We're buddies. You're not going to do this.
So we
Not anymore.
like I said, our goals are so aligned, and I think the way to view this is, it's not a winner take all. It's not one option takes the entire meat industry, out of business. I think people want.
But can Ethan recreate a real meat replacement or a meat-like product?
I believe it. Yeah.
And I believe what he's doing.
I believe he's already done it, and he's getting better at it.
I'm separating you guys before the panel next time.
So let me just say a couple of things on plant-based meats. Beyond Meat is really pioneering this space, and they're getting closer and closer to really getting taste and texture right, and he's definitely moving in the right direction. There's always going to be a segment that's going to continue to increase wanting that option. They had terrible options in the last 2-3 decades, not anymore. So I want them to have as big a chunk of that whole protein market as possible. I also believe really strongly that there's a large majority of the people in the world that really, really crave for meat from animal cells. And when they have the same meat that gets to the table, but through a different process, I think it's game over, because no one who's eating meat right now insists on meat getting to the table by the process it's getting there. When I've talked to all the major meat manufacturers, they really do not want to be in the feedlot or slaughterhouse business any longer than they have to. What they really want to do is to supply sustainable, delicious, affordable meat to as many people as possible. And when we get to the cost curve, which is challenging for us, but we're making a lot of strides, and I don't see any insurmountable barriers. So we're going to push that really hard, and we need to have both solutions on the table.
So just out of curiosity, because you're challenging Ethan, but Ethan, what's your challenge to Memphis Meats? What do they need to be better at aside from cost?
Right. So yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in what he's doing, and I looked extensively at it for a long time, about 10 or 12 years ago, and I think it's a great idea. I mean, I think it looks at a $200 billion market and more, depending on the geography. So I think there is plenty of room. I'm not just saying it to be diplomatic. I think that the three things that I look at, or the main things anyway, would be cost, and it sounds like you guys are making great progress on that. So that's great.
But the fact is, Uma's a startup.
Yeah.
You're still creating the product. You're on the shelves.
Yeah, and so yes, and we've been through all the pain of getting into the market. But I think the second one, and this is one that applies to my product as well. So Don Thompson, who was the CEO at McDonald's, is on my board, and he's a good friend. And I was with him and his wife a couple of years ago, and I was extolling on the benefits of, what I feel is a very impressive group of researchers and scientists at my company, and talking about an innovation lab, and it's called the Manhattan Beach Project, and we call it that because we wanted them to understand the global significance of what they're doing. We're attracting the best scientists, giving them the money to do their work, kind of stepping out of the way. But I was going on and on about the science, and Liz Thompson raised her hand and sort of said, "Excuse me, I had to interrupt you." She said, "Innovation is great for my iPhone, but I don't want to put it in my mouth." And I thought that was really interesting, right? I mean, that's a challenge for both of us, right? Is that, as we bring sort of high science to things that are culinary in nature, we have to be careful. And so that would be one area that I think for both of us, we have to communicate the simplicity of our process and make sure it's not characterized as frankenfood or anything of that nature.
Jeremy, maybe you could speak to this, but each one of these entrepreneurs faces specific challenges. I think Ethan's is really around sourcing the material and changing the supply chain. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's so much sourcing the material. That it takes 6 kilos of plant protein to get a kilo of animal protein. It's more.
But most farmers are not making the kind of protein you need. They're not growing the kind of vegetables that you need because they're growing it for livestock, right?
Yeah, and it's something that Jeremy's been very articulate about, is just the amount of resources that's required to feed animals. And so 80% of arable land is used now to feed animals. And so when we're trying to use those same resource base to basically create protein directly for our process, you run into some challenges. But what I'm so excited about is you look at places like Montana. I was just back at our farm in Maryland, where the economies it's really, really rough, right? Because these farmers are stuck between high input costs that Jeremy articulated and very low commodity pricing they're facing on the market, because they're feeding animals essentially, they're not feeding humans directly. And so we look at models where you can start to plant legumes and other protein-rich feedstocks in those fields where they're currently growing corn, soy, and wheat, and basically allow the farmer to participate in the human consumption market, not the animal consumption market. And that's really exciting for farmers. And there's a whole body of literature that's emerging now about how farmers can make more money by basically growing protein directly on their fields versus growing animal feed.
And factory farms survive because they're subsidized, and because actually the leather is a huge part of their profit margin.
Right. So how do they make more money? How do farmers make more money selling, plants or I'm assuming, in your case, it's pea protein, right?
Yeah, it could be pea protein, but
how do they make more money on that versus corn for
Sure. So some of the resources we can use, which the ADM and Soleil and others have to step up and start creating separation facilities, or someone else will do it for them, where they can basically take things like fava bean, lupin, camelina, mustard seed, all these great sources of amino acids, separate them and provide them into the market so we and other companies like ours can use them to create meat directly. But if you're a farmer who's growing those crops, you're going to make more money than if you're growing basically low value commodity feed for animals. And so it's essentially allowing a consumer to participate, or allowing a farmer to participate in a Whole Foods-like economy versus one that's directly into large-scale industrial agriculture. They're just going to make more money by selling directly to consumers.
The market's not there yet, though.
It's not
the
there,
demand isn't there yet for the
Right,
product.
and every centimeter in progress that we make on product quality, we welcome in hundreds of thousands more consumers. You're not going to convince him. You're not going to. Elon Musk didn't go out there and say, drive my car on a Monday and drive your Buick the rest of the week. He didn't talk about that. He talked about, I'm going to make something that's sexier, more exciting, and interesting. So it's all for us. It's not really about marketing. It's let's just make this product so good that people.
Future fact: factory farms will become a stranded asset, like coal has become, because it is so unsustainable. The maths doesn't work that it can feed the world. We don't have enough arable land to. The regulations will come in. Businesses are starting to become aware. You've got a lot of businesses now saying we're going to serve cage-free eggs, etc., but whether it's airlines or other companies. And consumer awareness through social media has upped the game dramatically. So that factory farms will become a stranded asset, which means the PE ratios and the returns are going to go down. And this is when we're going to see. So it's going to take time for these products, but there is a confluence today, this food tech and textile revolution. I'm wearing non-leather shoes that breathe better, and a spider silk tie that's been brewed by Bolt threads. These are all going to start replacing and be a lot cheaper than factory farm food, which is heavily subsidized at the moment.
What's the risk in investing in these companies? What's the investment criteria that you use to determine whether or not to make an investment?
It's the same for any venture investment in a way. What you're looking at is you're looking at the passion of the founder. Are they good? Like we just saw Pat Brown from Impossible Burger on the panel before, and Uma and Ethan. You've got to have the market. There's been plenty of meat replacements in the past that just haven't made it in the market. And so it's got to be a pull in the market rather than a push, and there is the pull coming. And
but just because people want better practices in industrial farming doesn't necessarily mean they don't want to eat a real piece of meat. Because we're talking about this movement, this technology movement, and you addressed this a little bit, but at the same time, consumers also want the real thing. There's also a trend to the real thing. You think that's just a blip and that's going to go away? Is it?
Sorry, you think a lot of the things on the shelves that say meat are the real thing?
No, but I'm saying they look, and the consumer has been trained to think they are the real thing, right?
Yeah. Uma,
Let me just jump in. If you can go to slide 6, I'll tell you where everybody's minds are fixated if you get to 6. Let's see. Okay, whenever I talk to meat producers, retailers, restaurants, all I have to do is this slide. They just kind of stop, headlights in their eyes. Because what I'm showing there is a bacteriologic plate. And on the upper right triangle where the yellow dot is conventional beef. And lower blue dot triangle is organic beef. On the left side is beef from our farm. What we did is we just streaked it and waited for 24 hours to see what grows on it. Within 8 to 9 hours, you see the fuzzy lines on the left side. They are basically bacteria filling up the plate, and they just kind of overwhelm the plate by 24 hours. And the reason for that fundamentally is most of the contamination of bacteria that happens in meat happens at the time of slaughter. That's happening in slaughterhouses. When you detach slaughter from meat production and you put that product on the table and say, which one do you want to choose? I think the conversation of real changes, what we ate now was not what we ate 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 150 years ago. So I think these moments are big opportunities for us to educate and saying we can continue to innovate in a way that people still can eat what they love to eat, but why not make it safer, healthier, sustainable?
Some people would say those streaks on that Petri dish mean that that's actually good for our immune system because it builds our defenses. But that's a subject for another panel. Ethan, what has been the most, can you describe sort of when...
That's true when you're 1 month old, not when you're adult.
Good point.
What's been the biggest lesson that you've learned launching the Beyond Burger? I guess it was last year?
Yeah.
Last year, right?
Yeah, I think getting into the meat case was really important. We're creatures of habit, and so our sales in that case versus the more obscure meat alternative section, at least 10 times. Just in terms of what we
It's
call
a game changer.
Yeah, what we call turns or velocity. It's just different to be there. And then the second is, I said this earlier, but just every little bit of improvement we make, you just welcome in just huge numbers of consumers. I mean, people want this. There's a latent demand for it. I think you said it, but there's just very few people will insist that an animal has to die for them to have meat, right? And so if we can create a way to produce it without that process, I think people will want that. And so it's really about making the product better.
I'm just curious, does anyone in the audience have any questions up until this point? Oh, whoa. Okay. All right. Right here in front.
Great. So thank you. I'm reasonably familiar with the science behind each of your companies as well as with Impossible. My question for you would be, let's assume that we fast forward a few years and you are both successful in developing a meat alternative that smells, tastes, feels exactly like a whole cut of meat. Why, and they're both cost competitive with traditional development. Why in that scenario would a consumer prefer a product that's based or derived from animal cells as opposed to derived from plants?
Do you want to go first, or I can go first?
I know.
Well, I think number one, you're putting up a fundamentally, I think, unachievable hypothesis that you could actually have identical tastes come from different methods of production of meat. The flavor of meat is so varied. There's little proteins in a cell, and it's not one protein. And if you talk to Impossible, they do say heme protein is really important. But I think it may not be for all. As billions of people start tasting it, the entire compositional proteins in a cell and what's around the cell is what is important. So we feel like we're basically not deciding which protein to put in for the taste. We're taking the whole cell and putting it in there. If we can crack the cost barrier, we feel the gates open wide for us. On the plant side, I'll let Ethan talk about it because I see them completely as allies. For them, they're capturing a market based on nutrition, health, safety. But even if it doesn't exactly match for taste, they still have an enormous market they could go after.
Yeah, so first, the Pat Brown panel is kind of like the opening act, and this is the main one. Is that right? Impossible sort of in the... Is that right? Is that how that works? Smaller room?
With the blood.
Less
and the
audience?
No,
Okay.
same size.
Okay. Well, anyway, all right. So, yeah.
Is that your real competitor?
No. Well, I think
That's
again,
why they're not on the panel.
we've done stuff together, but the question of taste and aroma is an interesting one. There have been 1,000+ molecules that really contribute the taste and aroma of meat, and what we're doing is trying to find the kind of 20% of that really drives the experience for the consumer, and then we're trying to match those with molecules in the plant kingdom, right? And so the burger's getting closer and closer. But whether or not a consumer is going to embrace our product versus Memphis Meats, I think it's going to come down to personal taste. I think they're both going to get the job done.
So is it fair to ask then, are you pursuing something that will be indistinguishable from traditionally developed meat, and you are pursuing something that may not necessarily aspire to that same level of indistinguishability?
No, our scientists believe very strongly that we can get it to the point where to the human sensory system, it's indistinguishable. Now, from a molecular basis, it'll be somewhat different, but yeah, at a sensory level, it'll be the same.
Go ahead in the front, and then I'll get you.
Lance Price from the Antibiotic Resistance Action Center at George Washington. Thanks, Jeremy. I have a question for you, Uma, and a question for you, Eric, Ethan. So animals have an immune system that helps protect them from infections, and we supplement that with all these antibiotics, which is creating this antibiotic resistance crisis, or part of the problem. When you're growing cells in a petri dish, I've grown cells in petri dishes before, and I know that cell cultures are very dependent on antibiotics because there's no immune system there. So how are you going to have a positive impact on antibiotic use?
Yeah,
Great question.
Really good question. So we think about this all the time. So when you have animals that are walking around that currently have immune systems, but still have trillions and trillions of bacterial cells in their gut, right? The reason they're getting antibiotics is for many reasons: to accelerate their growth, to also modulate the microbiome they have in their gut. And the immune system seems to be completely ignored. It doesn't matter if they have an immune system or not, they're still getting antibiotics for other reasons. For us, when we're looking on the cell culture side, we're not looking at growing it in petri dishes. We're thinking about massively scaling this up so they're in clean production environments where you have the inputs that are very well defined and traceable. There isn't a source of bacteria or a gut that is associated with right adjacent to our plants. There's the trillions of cells that are living right next to our cells are not there. So we feel we lower the risk of any bacterial contamination by, I don't know, millionfold or a trillionfold. And towards the end, there's still processing of this food. When they get packaged and sent out, there's still methods in current meat distribution where they try to get the log counts of bacteria down by using high pressure packing or whatever they do. We just don't have to go to that extent. We still have to have some clean systems, pasteurization towards the end or something akin to that. And we feel when we start distributing it in that manner, we don't have to do what pharma does, where they're growing it in small amounts and trying to keep it free and grow that exact cell and basically kill everything else around the cell. For us, we want all types of cells in there because meat has muscles, fibroblasts, adipose cells, endothelial cells. And so far, we've been very successful at modeling up and saying we won't have to use the levels of antibiotics that traditional meat is using.
But you are using antibiotics.
And then what we do is, in some areas we do, because now we are testing to make sure that there is absolutely no chance in our small testing facilities, because they're not still fully up to code of everything you need to do for GMP. But these are small testing facilities. So for our own testing, we do add some antibiotics in some of the batches, but not all batches. So for example, the one I showed you, there's no antibiotic in that. But some batches we do antibiotics. And as we start scaling up, we feel our clean production environments will be the answer, where we drastically reduce or eliminate antibiotic use.
But
And then really quickly, so Jeremy started talking about cows farting, and when I think about alternative meats, veggie-based meats, especially pea proteins,
I don't like
I
where
think
this is
about
going.
me
I just don't like
farting.
where this is
So, are you going to be able to produce a meat that doesn't produce a lot of flashlights?
I thought I was dressed and stuff. Like, I mean, I thought.
it's true. I mean, if we're going to bash the animals for producing gases.
Yeah. So there are some people who have that reaction, particularly on soy-based products. For us, though, with legumes we're using, we don't run into that. But yeah, but certainly I did. Actually, we had an early investor who was like, "I'd love your company," but that happened to me. So they said he ruined his date, and this is a well-known guy too.
So before I turn it back to the audience,
that was a soy, so we use pea protein. Yeah.
before I turn it back to the audience, each one of you have raised the challenge of health outcomes when it comes to traditional protein sources. I looked at, obviously, Ethan and I have talked about this extensively, the nutrition facts around Beyond Meat. I mean, it's actually slightly more calories than a traditional burger, about the same amount of fat, but way more sodium. You know, where do you rank that on your list of priorities when you're developing the next
Very
burger?
important.
And then for you, Uma, similarly, you know, if you are recreating red meat, then hypothetically it would have the same health risks that real red meat has, right? And can you manipulate that? But Ethan, if you can kick it off first.
Sure. Yeah. So on the nutritional profile, so on the sodium side, it's a bit of a unfair comparison in the sense that we are a seasoned burger, right? And so if we offered it as an unseasoned burger,
it's not an unfair comparison because you're trying to compare yourself to meat.
But so if you I mean, at the end of the day, you don't need to season our burger. You need to season a raw beef patty. But we are working on the sodium, and it's within very reasonable levels. Then you look at fat. We're half the saturated fat of a normal burger. We have no cholesterol, and so fat itself is not bad. And here's the thing: you can't serve too many masters. Meat has fat in it, right? Like if he provided his product with no fat in it, you probably wouldn't like it. You'd think it's like jerky, or you'd think it's like. And so you need to have. For me, I really want to be true to the meat experience, and so I can do it without cholesterol. That's great. We don't add anything that would have the impact that cholesterol does, and the saturated fat is lower. But then there's also, depending on what school of thought you ascribe to around, insulin-like growth factor, et cetera, there's none of that in our products, right? And so the health benefits of our products are very, very clearly ahead of what you would get in animal protein.
So I think the options of making meat a lot safer and healthier is possible with us, not with traditional animal agriculture, because if you want to make meat leaner, you have to take meat and strip away all the fat and try to get the lean muscle cuts. Where we start growing it, we can just grow it a lot leaner than what's possible with animals. And number two, the heme content or iron content in animals, you really can't change it. But when you're starting to grow the cells, you don't have to stick with the cell that has the highest heme content or iron content. You can also start modulating some of those. And in terms of the fats, the types of fats that are more beneficial is definitely an option for us to use the fats that are known to have a higher omega-3 ratios versus omega-6s. These are all options in our cultivation because we're building them from the ground up.
Yes, right there.
Hi, I'm Jenny Santi, and I'm a philanthropy advisor. I'm an animal lover, so it's easy to convince a person like me to buy this product. The question is for Ethan. But how about the normal consumer? How hard is it to convince the average person to consume this product, make the switch?
Right, great question. So when I started the company, I did a lot of the demonstration work myself, and I was living in the western part of the state of Maryland, which is Ohio and Kentucky, et cetera. And so I would go to the Whole Foods there to do a lot of the demo work. And it was amazing to me how many times I had the same conversation. It was typically a woman would come up to me and say, "I can get my husband to eat this, and he needs to because of X, Y, and Z." And so while we have to market to make our brand known, there's so much marketing going on for us already. Whether it's people going to their doctor and being told to cut down on meat consumption, whether it's the World Health Organization coming out with studies that put meat in the same category as cigarette smoking, processed meat. USC comes out with a study, Harvard, et cetera. So people are being bombarded with information that's leading them to think they should reduce their meat consumption, and then the environmental issues, et cetera. So it's all about the science for me. It's how do we make this so it's indistinguishable. And then if somebody still insists it has to come from an animal, they're going to become, I think, a minority. And if we can make it indistinguishable, as I'm hearing these messages, say, well, I'm going to go for that one.
I mean, the mayonnaise is a good example.
Yeah.
You cannot tell the difference between Just Mayo and Hellmann's. I'm invested in that.
In the back there.
I have two questions. One for Jeremy.
With your campaign against factory farming, aren't you just taking your British imperialistic colonial view to the third world where people are starving, and factory farming is actually a solution? We're just seeing that in Thailand. And how do you justify that?
And your second question?
Second question.
You'll take the second one first.
Second one's the other.
No, I think that's a great question because you can say it's okay for you in the West, but because we're eating, well, 10 years, 15 years ago, people were eating meat, fish, and eggs, a combination of that 3 times a day. When actually we were, 60 years ago, we were having it a couple of times a week. The health issues around eating meat 3 times a day are huge, and it's like in the third world. You might as well in telecoms jumping from wires to through the air. The third world, the developing world. This is the big measure of being middle class. Your meat consumption going up, and that's a major issue because actually there's study coming out shortly on all the consequences of the overconsumption of meat that Cambridge and a doctor here in the audience, Solomon, is bringing out on the problems of the overconsumption of meat. So, one, the math does not work. The 6 kilos of plant protein, the 4 kilos of wild fish from our seas to get 1 kilo of salmon, because you eat more before you die, it just doesn't work. And so you actually cannot feed the world with factory farms. So it's not a matter of taking away. Actually, it's realizing that we should be, to get to the next level of standard of living, which is what California is doing now, and the world will follow. It's actually eating less but better meat, and that will include technology solutions that end up being a lot cheaper than animal protein, as well as just ourselves being conscious that we shouldn't be eating so much. Does that answer your question?
And my second question is to the other two gentlemen. I mean, because of the tragedy of the commons, our bigger problem is fishing. There'll be no fish left in 10 years. So are you going to be able to give us artificial fish?
We'll give you real fish, not artificial, but from fish cells that can directly grow on the same platform we're developing. We're working on many other species in the background. I think the ones we've released so far, if you can go to slide 3, we've done beef last year, we've done chicken and duck, but there's other species we're working on. And one of the things we'll decide very quickly is which is possible to run down the cost curve faster, and that'll become the first product. But the tech that's being developed in the background is going to continue to evolve to tackle as many species as possible. And the fish question is something that's frequently asked. For example, bluefin tuna or mahi-mahi are pretty expensive to buy. So those may be the first places where people could start on trying to get the fish out. But there's so many species in fish. That's one of the problems. If you say beef.
But there's a bigger problem in fish. Everyone thinks they're eating fish and they're getting the right omega, etc. What we're seeing today is some companies come up with, to get the omega, why not go straight to the algae? And you've got large companies like Mars and other groups going straight to the algae. The farmed fish doesn't have the nutrients.
Yeah. I just find that the seafood market fascinating from the perspective of the overall system we've put together to feed ourselves. I was interviewing someone last week from a quality position at our company, sense of quality assurance, and she was coming out of a very large protein company that dealt with fish meal. And one of their biggest customers, not human, right? It was swine, pigs. Feeding the pigs. So we're taking all of these resources out of the ocean and putting them into land animals that we then put on our plate. Almost by design, you couldn't create a more inefficient way of dealing
and more
with things.
Stupid.
Yeah, and so I think there's research out of Washington State maybe, but where 33% of the weight of the catch from the sea goes into livestock industry. I mean, something like that. I mean, just alarming.
And be fully aware, policymakers are. It's a journey, but they are starting to be conscious of what we're doing.
Yeah, because arguably the shift would happen a lot faster with government incentives, but that's not going to happen with the meat lobby having so much power,
Absolutely.
right?
You can't even get guns out of schools here.
This is the British imperialism again. Yes.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm Jonathan Smiga with Keen Growth Capital, and we're impact investors in food and wellness, including plant proteins. Right. My culinary hat says, from my early days, what about the notion that the lover of a Morton's ribeye, bone-in ribeye, or a lamb shank, the more exercise the muscle has, or the closer to the bone, the greater the flavor. And it's one thing to make hamburger substitutes or the like. How do you view that curve from an adoption standpoint, simply relating to the consumer frontier?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In terms of texture, white and dark meats, the more the muscle is exercised, you have certain other features, there's different proteins that are turned on. We're also learning that. When we start harvesting, so for example, the process now takes cells, we put them in clean environments where they get the vitamins and the minerals and the growth factors and amino acids, fatty acids, and then we let them grow for a while and we harvest them at 4 weeks. But if you wait a little bit longer and start harvesting them later on, the texture starts getting different, because you're exercising the muscle a little bit more. Again, last month we introduced more textures. We had 3-dimensional textures where you start having longer fibers, just like the chicken breast meat. And our next evolution of that, as we start working on this, is trying to do more 3-dimensional structures like steaks. Now, bone-in is a really good question, because it's only at the premium high-end markets where bone-in is a really important thing. The US meat market, for example, is $250 billion. Of that, about 220 is like boneless, and maybe 20 to 30 is bone-in, and I'm thinking that's probably a challenge for us to solve later on. We're going after the initial boneless market, which is the very large economic opportunity.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm a dietitian. I guess the question I have is, first and foremost, how do you know that that your products are going to be okay for people from a health standpoint? And the second question to that is, how do you know they will be better? So the notion is, okay, it's one thing to remove meat and to remove all the problems that associated, as you were talking about, but to insert plants. And if I think about, okay, I know peas and I know how healthy peas can be for you, but is pea protein isolate? Are we going to find out 20 years from now or 10 years from now that has as many problems as some of the other isolates? Or, I love when people are eating broccoli and shiitake, but you've got extracts of them. Or I do love your fat profile though in there, so it's very good. Don't don't go changing. So I think the issue that we have is the question mark of also, as you bring the product forward, there is always going to be an argument. If you replace the really crappy product, you've got my thumbs up.
Right.
But how do you keep people then from, how do you say, as people start to really love this, how do you then say, okay, but I don't want this to replace all the full food that you're having all the time. Or
Right.
maybe you do want them to from a business model. So.
Right. That's a great question, and one I've thought a lot about. And I have my kids are 11 and 12, and they eat an enormous amount of our products, and as do I. And I should note that I used to be about 5 feet tall, and then I started eating. But there's nothing wrong with my product. No, but I think it's a couple ways to attack that. One is to rely on the smallest number of ingredients you possibly can, right? So to keep things simple, and we try very hard to do that. We told our scientists years ago that we weren't going to do genetic modification, so heme was not an option for us. We want the ingredient list to be understandable. Diversity is another way to attack that. My dream for the meat case is to be able to go and buy sausage one day that presents exactly like pork, but comes from lentil one day, comes from camelina the next, fava bean, lupin, all these different sources, so the consumer's not eating one thing all the time. I think that's really important. And the only reason we're so reliant on pea protein today is the supply chain is so underdeveloped, right? So bringing in a diverse set of proteins will help answer that question. And then just looking at the history of use, have there ever been any issues with the particular proteins we're using? We do study that quite extensively. So we're very cognizant of that, and I think that's, to me, when I think about using GMO approaches, I just think about the family. I think, who wants to be the first family to raise their kids on a GMO-based meat? And that's why I decided not to do it.
Do you know how long we've been isolating pea protein and consuming it for?
Well, it's been a while, because I'll tell you. So it's really, our supply chain is interesting. It's incidental. It's almost an accidental supply chain, in the sense that peas were largely scaled up for starch, and these starch companies then had derivative proteins, and so started to commercialize them. It hasn't been a very long time, right? But we can do a lot. We have a lot of expertise on our board and in our scientific advisory board. The head of the molecular biology department, Stanford Medical, for example. We ask these questions. We're very attuned to it, but it's a very good one. Yeah.
Just one quick question for Jeremy. How much resistance is the meat lobby putting up to these concepts?
Actually, surprisingly little, because there's such a consumer wave. So we got $2.25 trillion again. So just to explain, that something's taken off with institutional investors over the last decade. It's called environmental social governance. It's a bit like corporates with corporate social responsibility. But this ESG, there's a hub called PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, that was launched 10 years ago. It's now got 64 trillion signed up as a hub. So if there's an issue like Macando with British Petroleum, or diesel, corruption with VW, there's a coalition of investors that can get together. And pension plans are starting to, I'm answering this a slightly different way, but pension plans are starting to realize that if they're, for instance, if the temperature is 120 degrees in 50 years, what's the point of having a pension? Or the lens they'll look at building a textile factory in Bangladesh is, they'll say, the reason we need fire exits and foundations is because it's good business, nothing to do with human rights. It's not about ethical investment, it's about good business. And I forgot the question.
I was talking about the meat lobby and how much resistance.
We've done we sent out even a protein diversification, or the restaurant sector antibiotic risk. The protein diversification issue is about, there isn't enough meat protein in the world to feed the world, and it's an issue for companies. Writing to Walmart and Unilever and other companies, it's surprising to us that both investors, this is an issue for, and for the businesses. On the antibiotics issue, there is a meat lobby on it. So we've heard we've heard of all the proof about, well, does it transfer from animals to humans, etc. But if you actually writing to McDonald's, so the restaurant chain, they're very concerned that consumers, it's good business to be very aware of these issues. And so we're finding the meat lobby is very strong. The retailers are realizing it's much more profitable to address the issue, especially if you've got you have to address the issue if there are investors signing you up.
Uma, I'm just curious, have you gotten any
Can I mention something? There's the largest spaghetti, I won't mention the name, but the largest spaghetti manufacturer in the world is very concerned about food welfare. And I introduced Uma to them, and they're super interested.
Barilla?
Yeah, well, maybe. If but I'll tell you one story is, in terms of, yeah, it is. One story which is about the strength of the meat lobby is that he's very vocal on the quality of not using factory farmed chickens, etc. And the attack came. He was asked on radio, what does he think of would they use a gay couple in their advertising? And he said, no, we're traditional family values. And then you had a massive boycott, for an outcry after that, and the meat lobby was behind it. So we'll know we've won if I'm murdered.
Uma, have any of the large meat producers or companies reached out, asked questions? Are they poking around?
Yeah, definitely. I think without naming anyone, all of them have.
What are they? Okay, you're clearly talking your book, but what are they saying? What are they asking?
Well, I think the fundamental hypothesis is this, that they don't want to be in the business of slaughterhouses and feedlots any longer than they have to. And if they can actually produce meat in a way that is sustainable, delicious, and affordable, the switch is very natural for them. So they really want to know how we're doing it. They really want to understand what the cost curve is going to look like and when they need to start thinking about, because they're not like a typical venture investment. They're looking at horizons that are 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now. And this makes total sense for them to be aware of and know where they should be involved in this process. I mean, one thing I would also ask everyone is, people love eating meat, but the status quo is something that is just not sustainable. And because there's never been a choice before is why the default choice becomes meat, the way it's produced. When the default choice doesn't have to be that and we have an option on the table, it's going to be completely different. And we don't have to sit and speculate about little things we have to explain. But when we put a product out and do radical transparency like we've been doing as a company, it's the opposite of a slaughterhouse. Who wouldn't want to come and walk into a clean, bright environment where they can see the meat growing in front of them, coming over the production lines, and it smells like whatever is being cooked that day?
All right, session's over. Thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate it.